Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 13th colloquium. We have been going now for, well, over 6 years. So this is our 13th colloquium, and we're very, very excited to bring this colloquium to you around thought leadership on regulation and deregulation. So please let us know where you're from. We have attendees from all over the world. So please, in the chat, let us know where you're from. If you can't find the chat function, just click the Alt button, and the Alt key would bring up the controls for you. We also have open the reactions. So if you know, if you like what the speaker is saying, please react. You can laugh or love it or thumbs up. That would be great. Or clap if you enjoy it. You're welcome to connect with others on the chat. Put your LinkedIn profile there. Ask people to connect with you, comment. Really, the chat function is there for the community to engage. I will be posting anything that's mentioned, links to that information in the chat function, and you're welcome to do the same. But if you have questions that you would like to ask our speakers today, please do put those questions in the Q&A function so we don't lose them. Otherwise, they tend to scroll up and we get lost. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I'm just going to give it a few more minutes to allow people to come online. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Good Governance Academy for those who don't know about us. As I said, we've been around for over 6 years now. We were founded by Professor Mervyn King, who is also our patron and is closing today's colloquium. We bring together thought leaders from around the world to bring that thinking to, well, everyone who's wanting to attend in free webinars and other online events as a public good. And those matters and topics that we discuss are really around critical business issues. And it's for not only governance, but we speak about risk and AI and technology and governance assessments and also and risk and AI. I did say AI, all sorts of matters. So it's really, please join the community, follow our events, and join. We do issue certificates of attendance for your participation, just to reward you for being online. We know how time sensitive everybody is today, with so much change going on, and really that's what we're speaking about in these events. I just want to announce that we are launching our journal this year. It's called Advances in Corporate Governance, but we're not only talking about governance in the journal, we're talking about all these critical business issues that we speak about in our events and online events. So please, we are looking not only for academics. In fact, we're trying to bridge the gap between academia and practitioners. So if you have any advances, any new and interesting and exciting things that you're seeing in your organizations in practice and perhaps new thinking, please share them with us. It is an open journal, open source journal. That means there are no fees attached to it. And we will be hosting a conference on the 23rd of October, where some of the people who've been invited, who are participating in the journal, can actually present their papers and their insights in a more informal setting. For those in academia who understand about journals, we are registering to index the journal. So it will be recognized for indexing purposes and for academic purposes. And that means that by September, by the end of August, we need 10 academic papers. So please, for those academics out there, we need a minimum of 10 papers. So we really call on you to submit. Go and have a look at our journal page. You'll also see next to the journal, we've got a bookshelf, we have some training endorsed programs, and we also have a new initiative, Women on Boards. So we are looking forward to welcoming you all to all of those events. Without any further ado, welcome to our 13th colloquium, and I'd like to hand over to our chair, Alan Johnson. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and may I take this opportunity to thank you for the great work you do as the CEO of the Good Governance Academy and for putting together today's great agenda. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and wherever you are in the world today. We had over 900 registrations for this event, so it shows that the topic is of interest to many, many people from around the world. And let me welcome you all to today's 13th colloquium of the Good Governance Academy. Thank you all, as Carolyn has said, for taking your time from your very, very busy schedules to be here with us today. At this point, I would also like to extend a special thank you to our speakers and panelists at today's colloquium. So Cas Coovadia is the former CEO of Business Unity South Africa and is currently South Africa's Sherpa for the B20. And for those of you who may not know what the B20 is, it serves as the official dialogue forum with the South African business community to provide their important views to the G20, which this year is being hosted by South Africa. We've also got Dr. Agnes Tai, who is a professor and an author, is a trustee of Chapter Zero Alliance and also an investor. She focuses on sustainability, climate, strategy and risk, and of course, most importantly, responsible investing. We've also got David Carlin, who will be joining us soon, who led the TCFD program for the UNEP Finance Initiative and now advises governments and executives on how to thrive in a challenging and volatile world. And as Caroline said earlier, we certainly live in a challenging world today. He is recognized globally as a thought leader on sustainability, finance, and innovation. And we've also got Alison Greenhalgh-Ball, who is a director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She is also the chair of the Board of Trustees of the British Nutrition Foundation and is an advisor on several for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. And before her current roles, she had a very successful career as a senior leader at the Kellogg's company. So we have lined up some very eminent speakers today, and I'm certain that we will all benefit from their expertise, their experience, insights, and wisdom. I would also at this point like to recognize the outstanding work of our patron and founder, Professor Mervyn King. Mervyn founded the Good Governance Academy more than 6 years ago as a not-for-profit organization with the objective of collaborating and sharing information on critical government and business issues in order to raise the standards of governance in the private and in the public sectors. Over many years, Mervyn has received many accolades and awards for his lifelong public and academic service. Earlier this month, the Finance for the Future Awards, a collaborative effort between Accounting for Sustainability, A4S, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, and Deloitte, and they selected him as the inaugural recipient of the Lifetime Award for his excellent leadership, unwavering commitment to integrated thinking, and his influence across the sector on sustainability reporting that has set a standard of excellence. Mervyn, many congratulations, and you certainly are an inspiration to all of us. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Good Governance Academy's 13th colloquium. The previous ones over the past 6 years have included very relevant topics such as sustainable value creation, integrated thinking and reporting, the importance of ESG, corporate reporting, and connecting financial and sustainability reports, risks and opportunities of generative AI, the future of sustainability reporting and standards convergence, and enhancing governance accountability in the public sector. In today's colloquium, we will discuss and address the topic of sensible regulation and sensible deregulation. There's no doubt that deregulation is now a global trend. From Buenos Aires to Delhi, from Brussels to London and Washington, political leaders have pledged to slash the red tape that strangles the economy. I'm sure everyone will agree that years of excessive rules have probably choked economic and social progress. Deregulation done in the right way could lead to greater freedom, lower prices, faster economic growth, and greater equality. But the rush to demolish critical functions of government will come with many risks, and these are what we want to discuss here today. I read a recent article in The Economist which set out some facts. The US Federal Code runs to over 180,000 pages. It was only 20,000 pages in the 1960s. In the past 5 years, the European Parliament has enacted more than twice as many laws as the United States of America. In Europe, businesses are required to fill in more than 1,000 fields on an online form to comply with their sustainability disclosures, costing a typical business more than 300,000 euros. So the proliferation of red tape reflects how the world is changing. And some of it is, of course, necessary. The warming planet needs rules to limit carbon emissions. The rapid rise of the internet and AI requires codes to protect citizens from online scams. After the global financial crisis and other corporate malfeasance, which dented faith in capitalism, governments simply had to act to ensure good corporate behavior, higher standards of ethics in business, and the protection of society at large. But overregulation hurts businesses, particularly small businesses, which in almost every country across the world are the main drivers of economic growth. Many have said that rules beget rules, and that regulators always find new things to regulate. Well, maybe that is true, but countries that are lumbered by regulation and aging populations are now finding economic growth and productivity slowing down considerably. And this is why deregulation is important. But as The Economist recently posed, how can we make reform bold enough to count, but coherent to succeed? Deregulation will require significant political courage. By the IMF's reckoning, half of all electricity reforms and labour market reforms for older workers discussed in the rich world over the past 30 years were never implemented. I wonder why. Maybe too many vested interests. So you will hear more on this from our speakers and panelists. And after the presentations from Cass, Agnes, David, and Alison, we will have a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session. And after the Q&A session, Professor Mervyn King will close the colloquium. So let me now hand over to Cass to make the first presentation. Thank you, Cass.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity and for allowing me to make my contributions to this important topic. I'm going to use my current position, current role as the B20 Sherpa in South Africa. South African government is hosting the G20, and Business Unity South Africa, of which I was the CEO until the end of December last year, being the biggest business organization in the country, is hosting the B20. The chair referred to the B20 as a forum to bring together South African businesses to address a number of issues that businesses need to address and that businesses need to address in conjunction with other sectors of society, including government. I just want to quickly spend some time, and Carolyn, you can keep that slide on, it's fine. Just to take you through the B20, you see there 8 senior business people in South Africa and from the continent who are leading 8 task forces, and the task forces are mentioned there. And the task forces are comprised of business leaders, C-suite people, and business organizations from all of the G20 countries. And in these 8 task forces, we have, as well as business leaders from the continent of Africa. And in these 8 task forces, we have 1,300 odd business people coming together to address a number of issues. Our theme is inclusive economies that bring about prosperity in a cooperating world. And given where geopolitics is today and the sort of fractious world that we see before us, we believe that to achieve inclusive economies and prosperity in a cooperating world is important. We will be discussing numerous matters related to this. If you could just take the next slide on, Carolyn. We will be discussing numerous matters related to business, and these task forces will develop and deliver policy papers outlining policy recommendations to be handed over to the South African president towards August or so for consideration by the G20 before their summit in November. we are quite clear that the areas of regulation, deregulation, and what this means not just for business, but for the role of business in growing inclusive societies, the role of business in ensuring that the way we do business grows communities and addresses inequality. The role of business in working with government to enable government, particularly in countries where governments do not have the capacity. And I'm talking about your skills and other sorts of capacity to undertake the governance work it should be doing. And the role of business in working with other sectors of civil society to collaborate in building societies that are inclusive, that address problems of inequality, and that includes addressing problems related to unemployment, problems related to sustainable utilization of our natural resources, issues related to the move towards digitalized economies and what that means for jobs and what that means for skills. And we will be handing over a recommendation that was very, very practical and implementable actions that we want to track over the next few years as other hosts take over. So we are looking at the regulation and deregulation issue through the scope. Having said that, let me just make a few comments that will inform these discussions. Firstly, issues of regulation or deregulation are issues that need to be discussed and addressed by all sectors of society, not just government. Although government is responsible for regulation and responsible for enabling an environment where under certain circumstances self-regulation is also important. But we certainly are of the view that the debate on regulation or deregulation must be informed by a series of discussions that create an environment where critical sectors are able to optimize the roles they play in bringing about inclusive societies, in bringing about prosperity, and doing this in a cooperative way. I think it is government's role to enable appropriate regulations to protect citizens and enable inclusivity and equality. There are some who believe in free markets and in a way that creates a laissez-faire sort of approach. I don't think we are advocating that. We believe that regulation is necessary, particularly in societies that have problems of inequality or unemployment, or serious sustainability issues. Regulations are necessary to enable businesses, and let me concentrate on businesses here because that's where I come from, to enable businesses to optimize their role, to be profitable, but to do their business in a way that actually contributes to the problems that society has. I think regulation on the part of government should enable businesses and manage businesses in a way that businesses do play that role. And where there has been progress in regulations creating an environment where government is able to have the capacity to oversee and businesses have progressed in a way that they do business that would enable them to then self-regulate under certain circumstances. I think we need to move from regulation to self-regulation. And government needs to have the ability to enable regulation that protects society, but also oversee an environment where self-regulation is possible and oversee an environment where self-regulation does not detract from what we believe should be a societal contract between government and other sectors, including business, to do business and conduct ourselves in particular ways. I think the ultimate test of the balance between regulation, self-regulation, and deregulation under certain circumstances has got to be whether a contract between government, business, and other parts of civil society that must have at its center inclusive growth, addressing inequality, enabling maximum employment and ability to earn income across society, addressing issues related to sustainability, so that societies conduct themselves in an environment that is healthy both to people and to our natural resources, and ensuring that the maximum number of people in societies have a stake in the growth that we actually promote in our country and in countries. And that's got to be the test, that if through a balance between regulation, self-regulation, and deregulation, we achieve those, then we are actually being successful as a society. So in the discussions and the task forces have started working, and we have approximately 200 people per task force. And that's because we need to accommodate all the G20 countries as well as C-suite people and organizations from the continent. Task forces will probably have about 4 or 5 iterations of policy documents. They're being assisted by management consulting agencies who are knowledge partners, as well as by network partners like the World Bank, like the IFC, like in South Africa, the National Business Initiative and others, to actually come out with recommendations that are worth the paper they're written on, are not informed by the lowest common denominator, but actually enable business to make recommendations for a regulatory environment that includes the role of government in regulating, includes self-regulation, and under certain circumstances includes deregulation. And we will make those recommendations towards the end of August to our president for consideration by the G20 governments. I think, let me just finish by saying that given the geopolitics at the moment, given particularly, in my view, what's happening in America, because one could consider some of the actions of the current American administration as deregulation, doing away with a whole lot of state agencies and state functions, sending out the message that you want to enable businesses to be super profitable. But that's not, I think, what deregulation is about. And I think that it is, we actually hand over the hosting of the B20 to the USA next year, or at the end of this year. And so I think that it is important for us, and we are the 4th consecutive country from the South that's hosting the B20, after Indonesia, India, Brazil, and now ourselves. And I think it is imperative for us to actually put on the table in our recommendations some of the priorities of the southern part of the world, and what the southern part of the world needs to, the approach we need to have toward this topic of regulation, deregulation, and self-regulation. But also then talks to the impact of some of the action could have on countries in the south if we continue to have a fractured world and not actually cooperate and collaborate to ensure that inclusive societies are built across the globe. So we believe that we have that obligation as B20 South Africa to put the priorities of the South on the table. What regulatory environment is important in the southern part of the world, and how the actions of the northern part of the world could have either positive or negative impact on those. So let me stop there and hope that sort of leads in relatively okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cass, for opening the colloquium. So if I may now invite Dr. Agnes Tai. Agnes, over to you, please.
Thank you, Alan. I hope you can hear me well.
Very clearly, thank you. And I love your background.
Oh, thank you so much. It's not in Hong Kong. Well, we're approaching 7:30 p.m. Today, I'm very, very privileged to be sharing the floor with Cass and with Alison and David. I followed David for a very long time and learned a lot from him. So my background, let me try to share my screen first. All right. Are you able to see one screen, one page?
It's there, thanks.
Right, thank you. Alan, as Alan introduced me, my background is really in finance. For the last 45 years in banks, asset management, risk management, family office, and so on. But I also cross academia as well as governance institutes, and currently serving on several of them that I listed here. But whatever I say today is nothing representative of any of these organizations that I serve, just in case that I put them in an embarrassing situation. Because regulations, legal matters is really not my very own cup of tea. I look at regulations from an investor's perspective and from the perspective of training board directors as well as teaching at universities. So let me just go through the slides. Some of them, you may think, Agnes, you have too many words on it. Don't worry. It's because I want you to take them home and be able to share with your team of leaders and managers, just so that you can think through them and see if you want to come back to us, come back to Colin, and tell us what are within this talk today, and my slides, what are some of the aspects that you'd like us to get deeper in? Because we're here to help and serve. We're here to bring up the knowledge of everyone. I understand that very few of you register from Asia. I'm truly supportive and truly amazed and really supportive of people who stay up late for these sort of things. But let me just go through what my slides say. And don't read the slides. I'm not going to be reading the slides. I just want to highlight to you, as Cass was saying, that we are in a situation where the administration in the US is doing something and people read it as deregulation, which I agree with Cass that it is not. So since President Donald Trump took office, he's withdrew from the Paris Agreement, as you know, and unleashed a lot of these various administrative orders by the president. Some of them are really very significant in a way that if you know that the National Environment Policy Act is being considered as lacking authority, but it's been around for 5 decades, and it's been issuing many of the directives And now it's saying that it doesn't matter. They shouldn't be, and it has no power anymore. EPA is going to be eliminating the social cost of carbon calculations. EPA is supposed to release U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by the 15th of April. They didn't do that. And one of the NGOs called the Environmental Defense Fund filed a Freedom of Information Act against EPA to get the report released, but they did the release of the emissions data anyways a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago. So we can see now that the data that the world depends on from EPA and from a U.S. agency called NOAA, which is the National Oceans and Atmospheric Administration. Since decades ago, we've been getting this information, and now suddenly we are not getting the information, which leaves all the scientists at a situation where how are we going to be continuing monitoring the scenarios, monitoring the pollutions, the emissions, and refining our scenarios analysis for the corporates to be able to see far out into the future and make sure that they are going to be resilient for the business. I mean, we're going to be in a blank. And then a lot of scientists were being laid off, and plastic straws are back. But recently, now SEC, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which governs all the securities and equities market, since back in March, they've set out a set of rules for climate and sustainability disclosures. California has set them out a little bit earlier, like about in October of 2023. But just recently, a year later, in March 2025, SEC is already saying that they will not be defending their own rules, right? This is a comparison. You will get this PowerPoint later on. I'm not telling you that I have captured every detail of it. I just wanted you to have a feel of how California's law in environment is a lot more substantive, a lot more definitive and clearer, and the scope is bigger, as well as the coverage of the companies. They're very different from that of the SEC. So the California laws also cover private companies that operate in California, as long as they meet the threshold of revenue, then of a certain revenue, then in stages they have to report Scope 1 emissions, Scope 2 emissions, and Scope 3, and get some limited assurance. Now, there are 3 levels of assurance, as you all might know: limited assurance, reasonable assurance, and full assurance. I believe that other than Europe, in very small number of cases, corporates are not getting sustainability assurance that is up to the reasonable level. It's still very limited level where the data and the processes of collecting that data, the robustness of the data set and the collection and the processes and the authority of changing the data, all that is being looked at by the auditors, and then they assure that. So reasonable assurance goes a lot higher than that. We'll come back to a little bit about that later on. But what's the significance of SEC going back and the U.S. administration now unwinding and ignoring or not funding the initiatives, the climate initiatives under Biden administration? They were approved, or data that's been around for so long? Just look at the U.S. equity market. 51% of world equity market cap is captured by S&P 500, 8% captured by the rest, and you have nearly 60% of the world capital markets captured in the U.S. Now, if the U.S. listed companies are not under any obligation to disclose as at a high level, as at a transparency level or completeness as the rest of the world, then you can see that from an investor's perspective, when I look at these companies, how am I going to know that I'm comparing apples to apples? oranges to oranges when I look at two different companies in the US or in Europe or in Asia. So climate action or non-action by US listed firms really matter. Now you heard so much about Omnibus. Omnibus on the 16th of April. Omnibus is about simplifying the CSRD and the CSDDD. I'm sure most of you already know that CSRD is Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and CSDDD is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Now, being directives, they are not like regulations. It's like SFRD ending with a SFRDR ending with an R is a regulation, ending with a D is a directive, which means any violation could only be incurring civil law cases. So it's a little bit less stringent. But then they had to stop the clock in April. What does that mean? Well, originally there was the CSRD and CSDDD was supposed to get the companies as well as the supply chain of the companies to disclose a lot of sustainability data, not just environment, but social as well, like labor and whether the supply chain pay fair wages, whether there was labor abuse or child labor and all that. But it was supposed to be under the omnibus to make it simpler, ease the compliance costs, and get everybody on board, consolidate, harmonize, and so on. Well, there's something called the do no significant harm, which says that a company will, under the EU taxonomy regulation, will have to abide by one of them and not violate the rest of them, and at least the six of those mitigation and so on, those 6 objectives for you. So if you do one objective and not do negative things to the other objectives. Now, these are all watered down. So the European Commission the European Central Bank issued their own opinion on the omnibus. The omnibus amendment is now going to carve out 80% of the previous entities, so make the entities number a lot smaller by requiring only the very large companies to go by them, and they delay the schedule. And there were so many amendments that a lot of opinions were being voiced by NGOs, by investors, that this is really making these disclosures less useful, less decision useful for us. However, there's good things about it because the compliance criteria, the reporting criteria, the burden on the SMEs are now a lot lower. Now, but then European Central Bank has now come through with these and has summarized their paper published on the 8th of May for you. There are things that the ECB support because it would enhance competitiveness and maintain the Green Deal and the Sustainable Finance Action Plan objectives. It will harmonize, make it reliable, standardize the data, and they want the measures to limit reporting burdens on smaller value chain entities. That's all good. And there are recommendations saying that include the medium-large entities under proportionate simplified standards. And all the credit institutions, whether they're big or they're small, they need to be subjected to reporting. And there should be better calibration of scope data and the scope of and the data, greenhouse gas emissions. How do we calculate those? Must be robust and comparable, sector-based guidelines, and we have to request make sure that the SMEs know that if they're requested to submit the data, they have to give the data, even though they're not required to do it mandatorily. Retain a review clause for financial sector because the financial system has to have its own integrity with the portfolios. And then ECB has actually regret and opposed something. They regret the removal of empowerment to develop sector-specific reporting standards. So Cass talked about self-regulation. So a lot of industries have done a lot of self-regulations. Even in Hong Kong, we have seen the maritime industry. They did their own they make sure that they reduce emissions, make sure that the fuel has much less sulfur, much faster, much earlier than the Hong Kong government told them to do so. So self-regulation is a good thing. Oppose raising turnover threshold for third country firms and potentially widen data gap, which disadvantage EU firms. That means if the third country firms are not going to be included because the turnover isn't that high enough to disclose, that means the EU companies will have to disclose, whereas the third country don't have to. Then there will be a disparity. And then the ECB actually urges and reminds us that simplification should not undermine benefits of the sustainability reporting. We should have prompt adoption of limited assurance guidelines, and timely agreements and transportation of all the new rules to the legal certainty, meaning asking the EU 27 states to quickly adopt them and don't delay any more than necessary. Now, I live in Hong Kong. I read, speak, and write Chinese, so I read the Chinese government. If there is any deregulation, I don't really think that helps too much in Asia. Mainly because Asians' culture is that we actually look at the carrot and the stick. So the stick are the regulators, and with the carrot are the investors' money. All right. So in Singapore, where sustainability is really doing well, and in China now, all the new rules and regulations are being published. When they have a top-down approach, then companies sit up and they listen, they do it, they take action. So I want to point out 3 major pieces of information. Number one is that in May of 2024, the 3 stock exchanges in China, they all belong to the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. All of Asia's majority, I would say all, but the majority of Asia's, I don't know Pakistan, I don't think so. Beyond India, I don't know. But within up to India, all of North Asia, South Asia, ASEAN, we are part of Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, and so they require companies to disclose on sustainability. China now has issued ISSB aligned sustainability reporting requirements, but also added something about the double materiality, i.e., the companies need to disclose if they impact the planet and people, and they need to take care of the social part of things. Why? Because China has lifted 900 million people out of poverty in 30, 40 years time span. They don't want to get back into poverty. China is not a communist country. It's really a socialistic capitalistic country. So now we don't want to get back into poverty. So all these rich big companies will now have to do their part to look after the less resourced regions and less resourced communities. That's one. But more importantly, by August of last year, the State Council published what they call the opinions. But the State Council is the representation of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, meaning the State Council is of the highest authority. So when the State Council says something, have their opinion, that means the whole world in China, everybody has to listen. And they want the whole China to preserve resources, that is water, land, air, all these natural resources, and save energy. So 2 main things, green transformation. But look at the red part and the blue part that I highlight for you. There could be litigation going forward on compensation on the environment damage. Meaning what? Meaning that the provincial government and government and the ministries can actually take companies to court for polluting. Now, this is not new because China has trained several hundred environmental prosecutors using Western prosecutors to train them and have been prosecuting companies, halting their operations, barring them from operations, stopping them if they pollute. This has been going on for several years. But the blue part is most important because it says it can be public interest litigation. That means class action. Now, nobody's heard of class action in China, right? So if China starts class action lawsuits, that means the rest of Asia could start to follow. Now, this is going to be very serious. And then at the end of last year, in December, Ministry of Finance with 9 different departments published sustainability disclosure rules, which by 2030, every entity has to follow. And by 2027, they will publish all the sector-specific guidelines and frameworks and so on. But double materiality is in there as well. Maybe not the double materiality that we at GRI or the GRI that I serve, we think about, but China's really very much about the social aspect of double materiality. Okay, but the most important thing is that President Xi Jinping, he has publicly said in April in a conference that before COP30, all economic sectors and all greenhouse gases will be covered in China's NDC. Now, all greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but also methane and HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which has a much higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And you already know that methane has, in with a 20-year short lifespan, has 84 times GWP of carbon dioxide, right? So China is going to cover everything. And the significance, and it says adhere to multilateralism, must deepen the international cooperation, accelerate people-centric just transition, people-centric. And China stressed that we will be looking after our fellow developing neighbors. So meaning that we want to say common and long-term well-being of all people, of all countries, China will try to help. But all parties have to do the best. So why is this significant? Because when President Xi Jinping himself comes out to state that and pledge that, that means China is going to do it. And this is a very strong commitment. So the contrast is US backtracking, China going fast forward. All right, so what about Asia? Well, we mostly staying on course. Indonesia is doubting the Paris Agreement's validity, but Indonesia is now looking to China for some of the climate funding. The ASEAN Stock Exchange has all adopted ISSB and so on. Our Hong Kong Monetary Authority, a significant move in October last year is that we unveiled what we call a Sustainable Finance Action Agenda, stating that the funding, we're going to be the funding platform for green, for climate, for sustainability, for the region and beyond. So it's not just around Hong Kong, Greater Bay Area. It's going to be ASEAN. It's going to be Belt and Road countries. So what happens there will be significant. So in Europe, UK is the most ambitious, and we know that the COP30 is going to come back. So my last thought to be left with you is that this is a time for business leaders to stay on sustainability course with your forward vision and with boldness when policy and regulatory landscapes shift. So we know what the US administration is doing, but 4 years later, it could reverse course, right? A different precedent. So we better stay on course so that we earn the social license to operate and keep your reputation. And for us investors, we want to know whether you walk your walk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnes. And I'm sure we'll come in the panel to talk about how does the world cope with what looks like some diverging moves across the globe. I'd like to invite David. David, thank you very much for joining us. I know you're extremely busy and I know you've got back-to-back meetings the whole day. So I really appreciate that you could fit this into your very busy schedule this afternoon. So welcome, David, and may I turn over to you, please?
Thank you so much. It's really really a pleasure to be here and to be with all of you as well. I'm going to speak a bit, kind of from a global standpoint and give a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what's going on, how sustainability is evolving and changing within the world today, because I think what we are seeing is a bit of a sea change, but I think the answer of, is this all negative? Is this, going back, a number of years? Is that really happening? I think the answer is no. And so I'm going to share, some of the slides that me and my team have put together. Just a little bit about me as I'm bringing these up. I'll talk a little bit, and I'm just going to share here. So I founded the Risk Center at the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative, and the Risk Center really was set up and set out to help organizations to manage and understand the risks that they face when it comes to climate, when it comes to the environment, but not just the risks they face, the risks that communities face from their activities, from their financing. And we really looked at a variety of advanced methods, scenario analysis, and put together, I think, about 36 papers in my time there on sectors, on decarbonization strategies, on opportunities, and of course on regulation, because regulation plays such a key role in how finance flows, how it doesn't flow. And so from that work, I also worked with the Glasgow Financial Alliances for Net Zero. My team now really works as active advisors to governments, to financial institutions, to corporates. And I also work as a teacher with University College Dublin and Cambridge's Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So I spend a lot of time trying to think about how we communicate these messages and how we explain. And so, as I said, in talking not just about what we do, but really where sustainability is going this year, I think we begin the conversation really frequently with this: well, is sustainability dead? And I think that, going back to this piece that I had written for Forbes a few months ago, the answer is a resounding no. Sustainability is constantly evolving. And I think what we're beginning to see are firms and leaders starting to say action matters more than words. We don't want to hear about new commitments. We don't want to make new commitments. What we need to do is begin acting on the strategies we've set out. The second is this idea of embedded sustainability. Previously, a lot of sustainability was, again, waving that flag, saying, hey, this is what we're doing, or we're hiring consultants to help us set a net zero target. Now, a lot of that is internal enabling. How can you provide knowledge? How can you provide information to the other parts of the organization with insights and data from sustainability? So it's not just going in the report. And then finally, I think the real critical measure, which is the yardstick that everything was going to have to be judged from, is value creation. Does this work for the organization? Is this helping the organization to be more competitive in a changing world or not? And if you can't kind of stand up to that mirror test, then I think you see a lot of initiatives that are being changed and challenged. But I think for initiatives that do communicate that value, their importance has only become more clear as we've looked ahead. So as I said, just to jump around a little bit and give you kind of a flavor of some of the analysis we've put together, and we'll go deeper into the US and Europe as well in a moment, but we can see the US really is stepping back on climate, on its international obligations and commitments, both to organizations like the United Nations, to its own development organization, USAID. We've seen a lot of regulatory pullback as well. And again, I agree with that point. It's not deregulation. I think this is really a kind of scattershot approach that is ideological. It's not really clear where this will end up in terms of helping growth, in terms of, providing American businesses competitiveness. I would argue it won't really, because it'll leave investors with less information, more of a view that the government is just capricious and willing to change at a moment. But I think you can see that what's happening in the US is having effects in other places. On the other hand, we'll talk about kind of how the picture is a lot more nuanced. The European Union, of course, was a global leader on sustainability regulation through its corporate sustainability reporting directive, the recently passed due diligence directive. And yet at the same time, many of those companies in Europe have been struggling under the burden of what is a very rigid and rigorous process. And so the omnibus bill to revisit this really aimed to set that back and really aimed to say, we do need to stay simple. We do need to make these things make sense. A lot of people, and I'll talk in a few moments about Europe, a lot of people have kind of misread this and said, oh, well, you know, Europe is giving up on sustainability. Hardly. I think you are seeing in Europe's new security funding, in Europe's new positioning on energy independence, you are seeing sustainability critically embedded in there. So I think those that have seen and expected this to be a turnaround are not going to be correct. And then in other parts of the world, just to give flavors, you know, we heard a lot about China, we heard a lot about other parts of South Asia. Japan recently adopted its reporting standards, which are very similar to the ISSB as well. They have 3 elements instead of 2. But otherwise, you know, in a large sense, Japan kind of continues with its leadership that it brought to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. They continue to do that. And then in a place maybe you wouldn't expect for the transition, the GCC, the Gulf, what we're seeing are a number of countries setting their first disclosure requirements. Now, why are they doing that? These are countries with, you know, a lot of oil, a lot of gas. What's their role? Well, I think even these countries are doing something that America isn't, which is they're recognizing that the world clearly is changing and they need to step up and they need to say, how do we diversify our economies? How do we also make where our jurisdiction is attractive to capital? And can we make our capital attractive to others? To do that, we're going to need to play by the rules of the game. And so we're seeing more and more regulators in these countries really taking the step and really moving forward. And I think that that is a positive sign that even in a place that is particularly focused on hydrocarbons, they are continuing and moving forward. So let's just talk a little bit about the US, because I think it is the elephant in the room. I, as an American, you know, I'm obligated to talk a bit about my home country or country of birth. This has been unprecedented, and I think it's important because, as I said, sustainability is not dead. We'll talk about in a few minutes what's happening in Europe. We'll talk about, you know, what all of this means for you as leaders and what to do with this. But I think sometimes silence is normalizing. Sometimes we say things like, oh, you know, there's going to be an upside to this, or this is going to, you know, come back around. And the point is, I think we do need to look with clear eyes at what is happening in America as being completely unprecedented, I would say, in the history of modern democratic societies, not just the loss of the rule of law, but really on this particular issue, on climate, on sustainability. You are seeing a prolonged and sustained assault, and an assault that is really about not only throwing a wrench in global collaboration, the withdrawal of Paris, of course, acts to, you know, limit predecessor policies around electric vehicles and renewables, blocking using, you know, judicial and governmental power to either harass or limit the production of renewable energy, the promotion of fossil fuels in a very active way, and aims to really pull things back. And what's to me shocking about this is not even a free market ideology. This is so politically motivated that about 18 of the 28 districts in America that were the biggest beneficiaries from the Inflation Reduction Act under the Biden administration voted Republican. So these are people that voted for him. And I think what you're beginning to see, you saw it a bit with tariffs as well, is the government, because of its ideology, will blunder into these very unpopular policies. They're not deregulation because there isn't a strategy there, but there is this idea. People in America want clean water. People in America, if you're investors, you want information. People in America want to be seen as doing more, not less, in terms of securing their energy future. And so I think what you're beginning to see here is, with this issue around incentives, I think you're going to begin to see more and more pressure. And I think my expectation is it will begin to look a bit like the tariff discussion of jump forward, jump back. And volatility is not good. Again, we're not pretending that this is good. We're not pretending this is helpful to climate, but we are really focusing on the reality that this is both unprecedented, but it's also something that on a global basis, the rest of the world is moving ahead and continuing to move on. And even in Europe, I think the messaging has been, Europe is getting almost dragged back because of Trump. And I think that gives way too much credit to him. To be completely honest, the real thing that we're seeing in Europe is that the European model began very much on a regulatory basis, began very much on a focus of how do we set the rules of the game. And I think as a result of that, a lot of those rules hadn't really been put into practice. And once they were put into practice, they saw how onerous and burdensome that could be. Now the pendulum has swung back a bit the other way and saying we do need to simplify. We have to be competitive. We have to listen to business. And yet at the same time, I think there's enough people in Europe, enough in the parliament, but also in civil society, and even in a place like the European Central Bank, who have spoken up to say, we need this information. So agree, we can be a lot more efficient, and you can see bigger firms maybe should be the ones that are more covered. You can see things like assurance, maybe that's something that is brought along more slowly. Things like double materiality, still important. So the idea is it's not everything being scrapped. What we're seeing is simplification, and we're also seeing Europe pushing back against being anything other than a sustainability leader. If I had to kind of look at the major blocks of the world right now, Europe still has gone the furthest and fastest on sustainability. And this pullback is from a position of leadership. It's not dropping them back the way the US has. So I think that's important to appreciate. What are like my 5 quick hits? And then we can get into the fun stuff for you, which is, recommendations. How do you take advantage of these things? How do you think about them? How do you act in a more effective way? Well, first off, let's see what we're seeing globally. And I think that the International Sustainability Standards Board remains largely the leading global standard. It certainly isn't universally adopted. And in many places, as we just heard about with China, and as I was mentioning with Japan, it is being adopted and then amended in certain ways, but a lot of the connectivity is very close. And the idea here is this is a workable international system, a workable international approach. Is that the answer? If everyone fills out their ISSB S1 and S2 reports, will the world be sustainable? No, of course not. But that's like the same as me saying, if I write down a training plan, will I be able to run a marathon? No, only if I run it. And so I think that the ISSB globally, that adoption is a very notable development and one worth mentioning here. As I said, talking about America, we've gone backward. And yet at the same time, states, really important states like New York and California has the 5th largest economy in the world as an individual state. They are actually continuing to not only create incentives for renewable energy, but actually to create regulation around disclosure, reporting. And what's interesting here to me is this actually doesn't reduce, what the federal government is doing is not actually decreasing the regulatory burden, but actually in some ways increasing it, because what they've done is they've removed the federal coherence and reverted it to the states. So that means in the same challenge that Europe has had, instead of having one federal government setting a rule, now you have 50 states, all of which are talking. And you can see in some states, you have to look at sustainability criteria. Other states, you're told not to. And all of this is just adding to compliance costs. It's adding to business inefficiency. So I think that is the real upshot of what we see in America. The other part is everyone keeps talking about America, but Trump was elected a few months ago. And again, the pace has been really fast. But that was 6 months ago when he was elected, 3+ months since he has been in office. We have newer news. We have newer data coming in about how the world sees sustainability. We saw the election in Canada where Mark Carney, someone I worked with the Glasgow Financial Alliances for Net Zero, he was brought in to lead the government in a surprise victory for the Liberals. On the other side of the world, Australia, the Albanese government won again, continuing their plans on climate progress. They're very likely to be the host of COP31. So the idea here is universally, people are not rejecting sustainability. We've seen 2 elections that have really gone in the other direction. I talked a bit about European requirements, but the main thing to remember is stay up to speed on what these things mean for you. This is fast-paced. The European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, or EFRAG, has been given 6 months to work on updating the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So this will be a drip feed. Keep your eye on this, whether you're starting work, in the midst of work, keep your eye on that space if you're based in Europe or you have business there. Final point is transition plans are kind of a new frontier. We saw the great work of the UK's Transition Plan Task Force last year. What we're now beginning to see, and now seeing in increasing measure, is the frequency that all of these things are not only being adopted by the ISSB, so those materials the UK Transition Plan Task Force created are now held and housed by the ISSB, but we're also seeing other jurisdictions begin to ask about plans, because again, we're not looking at commitments anymore. We're looking at plans. That's one of the big ways that things are changing. So the last part here is to say, well, what does this mean for you and how can you do something about it? And what I would begin with is thinking, as much as we complain about the lack of data, let's be clear and let's recognize that there is more data out there today than there ever has been in the past. But are we making better use of it? And I think the answer to that in many instances is no. So what do we need to know to get the insights that will be helpful? Next, can we develop products that are aligned for the new economy? How do we future-proof products? Nobody wants to put something out that is going to be rendered obsolete. Nobody's going to go through the production. Imagine thinking about, a well that you're drilling for oil. If you're only going to pump for a year, it's not going to be worth the cost of drilling. And fossil fuel companies obviously know this, but other companies in the economy should know this about sustainability, which is we need decisions, actions, products that are around for the long haul. The next is work with your clients and suppliers. Realize that this isn't a single journey, it's a shared success. If they're getting through where they need to do, less volatility for you, more opportunity. Become also, depending on your business model, you can be a trusted advisor. If you are a financial institution, that can be to those that you finance, but you can also be a trusted advisor in terms of consumers. We see this actually a lot with energy companies. Companies like Octopus in the UK and others really aim to help the consumers to maximize their own value, maximize what they're doing. And I think that is a real differentiator. The next thing is considering how climate and the transition fit into pricing. A lot of people say, hey, we've done analysis, but when I ask people, is it incorporated in your pricing, in your risks? Then the hands start to go down. They say, oh, well, we did an analysis of it, or we issued a TCFD report. But if day to day you're not making decisions based on this, then it's not having the effect it needs to have. And then finally, there's so much growth out there in adaptation, in low emissions areas. Look for the areas that are expanding. I mean, this is, I almost don't need to go into more detail because this is part and parcel of your business, which is finding areas where there's growth and then bringing that into your business in order to capitalize on it. So just to conclude, I'll talk a little bit about the work that my firm does. We do really diligent focus on capacity building, trying to give institutions, if they're financial institutions, and their corporate clients, the tools they need to succeed. We work directly with corporates as well as governments to think about where are client and consumer priorities. How do these regulations play a role in that? How do they change things? We also look at where the opportunities are. What new regulations, what new incentives exist that can support a new product, a new business line? And next, thinking about, in terms of sustainability regulations themselves, what are the ways that you are going to need to meet your obligations? But very often, what are the ways your portfolio companies are going to need to do that? What are the ways your suppliers are going to need to do that? So we work on capacity building around that. We work on report development. And then also internally, these are tools not just for managing the future, but also managing your employees, enjoying and supporting the value and engagement they get out of working for a place that has a purpose. So these are the things that we do, in our workshops, in our series. So obviously, I'm delighted to speak more about our work. You can get in touch with us here. Here's our information. I'll throw that into the chat as well. But really excited to talk about this evolving landscape, because at the end of the day, there is a lot we can do, but we need to pick our heads up and start looking at that world around us, because it's changing, I think, a lot faster than we think it is. So with that, I'll hand back, but really a pleasure and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, David, and really appreciate your interventions. And I think we'll have a lot of discussions about being positive. And I think I've picked up, you talk about regulation, but maybe it is about simplification as opposed to purely just deregulation. But we'll come back to that. So really appreciate that. I'd like to now turn over to Alison, who's been very patient this afternoon. So Alison, if we go over to you, and then when you finish, we'll just take a sort of a 5 to 10 minute break, allow people who have joined us this afternoon, this evening, and in the morning, their time to just refresh, and then we'll come back and form the panel. So over to you, Alison. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Alison.
Can you hear me, and can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Alan. And what an amazing kind of conversation that we've had so far. I've certainly learned a lot, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all today and around the globe. So seeing everyone's kind of representation from different corners of the globe has been really wonderful. I'm Alison Greenhalgh-Ball, as Alan introduced earlier, and I'm here today as the director of the equity team at the World Business Council for Social Development. I'm also representing, importantly, the Business Commission to Tackle Inequality, as we are the secretariat for that at the World Business Council. So when we discuss regulation and deregulation, we often focus on efficiency or market freedom. We certainly heard some of that today. But today I would like to really highlight a critical dimension that often gets overlooked, social equity. And how do our regulatory frameworks either advance or hinder a more equitable society? And what's our specific role in that journey? So just move to the next slide. Sorry, just sorry, a bit clumsy here. So first of all, if you allow me just to introduce the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, in case you are unfamiliar. We're a global community representing 240 plus leading businesses around the world who are all driving system transformation, ultimately for a better world and planet. We work across 60 countries, representing 24% of global corporate revenues and over 19 million employees. And David's comment on action earlier certainly resonates with our kind of intent here, and indeed our community. So how can we really focus on action here to kind of advance that journey? So if we just move. And going a little bit deeper into kind of the team that represents equity at the World Business Council, I'd like to just introduce you to our body of work here. So we work with those companies that I mentioned, really striving to embed social equity really at the heart of their corporate strategies. And I highlight here some of our kind of working groups that we kind of represent. So whether that's looking at advancing living wages and incomes, supporting a just transition, strengthening diversity, equity and inclusion, which is certainly topical right now, embedding human rights, due diligence, or indeed driving social performance and accountability. So these are our kind of core working groups that we really kind of at the heart, push to work with companies on their action plans to drive this at the heart of their strategies. And I would say in today's rapidly evolving policy landscape and uncertainty, or frankly being overwhelmed around regulations like CSRD, CSDDD, and the Omnibus Directive, for examples, businesses really need to kind of, cut through the noise. They need clarity on how to move forward, both with confidence, but also responsibility as well. And so in this context, I'd like to kind of look at the question of how regulation and deregulation can help to shape social equity and why this is more urgent than ever before. Few reflections maybe on where regulations can unlock progress, and how do we strike that balance that really empowers innovation and business success and competitive advantage, whilst really protecting the most vulnerable. So this will be familiar more probably to you than any other audiences. How the evolving landscape is quickly kind of changing, and how regulation plays a real kind of role in safeguarding those who have the least power in society, whether that's workers, consumers, marginalized communities, and small businesses. It can help level the playing field, ensuring living wages, fair working conditions, environmental protections, and corporate accountability. Yet this landscape is evolving rapidly and is so complex, and of course varies across the regions. You know, if we look, you know, I'm sitting in Europe at the moment, so for many organisations who are based in Europe, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive really is topical and front of mind. And how can companies really be accountable to kind of human rights impacts across their kind of global value chains? And how can they do that that's really impactful without being overwhelming? Yet regulation is not without its challenges. When really poorly designed or overly complex, it can exclude smaller enterprises that lack the resources to comply. It can also unintentionally disadvantage companies in some parts of the world, particularly the global south, where regulatory capacity and market conditions often differ. So do we acknowledge these realities? And if so, we you know, it's imperative that we do so if we want regulations to be both effective and indeed fair. So who benefits from regulations or deregulations? And importantly, who bears the cost? Well, deregulations is often promoted as driving innovation or economic growth, or in certain contexts, it can be. But without strong oversight, it can really dismantle critical safeguards, resulting in workers losing protection and bargaining power, consumers facing lower safety standards, marginalized communities bearing the brunt of externalities, responsible businesses being undercut by those who are less scrupulous, future generations paying the price of rolled back protections. And of course, recent geopolitical developments that we've just heard David refer to, and indeed Agnes, may encourage certain countries to deregulate to maintain their so-called competitive position. And how may this negatively affect businesses that are already deeply invested in compliance? Conversely, smart regulation can increase social equity by creating fairer conditions for historically disadvantaged peoples and groups and communities. Workers may benefit through fair wages and safer conditions. Marginalized communities gain standards that reduce discrimination. The environment is protected through limits on harmful practices. Consumers receive higher product safety and transparency. Businesses compete on a so-called level playing field that rewards ethical conduct. So how do we find the middle ground? What does smart regulation look like? Well, I'd argue, you know, how do we move from this really fragmented policy landscapes towards coherent, smartly designed regulations, smart, adaptive to our fast-paced, changing and evolving world? How can kind of our frameworks be outcome-based, focus on real-world impact, not just process in itself? How can they be context specific and really reflect the different business sizes, sectors, and indeed kind of regions? And importantly, how can they be co-created? How can we develop with real meaningful input from those who are directly affected? And for example, I'd like to give an example that's close to home in WBCSD, our Living Wages and Incomes group. We've recently seen companies voluntarily commit to action with real momentum that's happening when regulatory clarity sets expectations and businesses quickly follow with innovation that really addresses implementation. Also, the TISFD, so those who are not familiar, the Task Force on Inequality and Social Related Financial Disclosures, is first and foremost an initiative to reduce the complexity and burden of reporting for the social dimension of sustainability. And to this end, it plans to align its design to the basic architecture of those that's already existing. So the TCFD and the TNFD frameworks really offer their best practice and elements of also GRI. And we are playing a key role in this development, not only to feed into the process through the business lens and our member base, but also our CEO, Peter Baker, is also the co-chair of the TISFD. So more to come on that. And we're really heartened to see how that can be a bit of a game changer for the social landscape. So in the meantime, in the face of regulatory uncertainty, I would argue the best compass remains international standards, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines. Certainly that's what we are sharing with businesses, and those who are the front runners, so to speak, still use those as their compass in hand. And equally crucial is stakeholder inclusion. Workers, smallholders, Indigenous communities really need to help shape those rules and not just be bound by them. And finally, we need policy coherence. What does that look like? If there's trade or labour or climate policies must reinforce, not contradict each other, if we're really going to deliver on ambitious sustainability and equity goals. If we want regulation to truly advance social equity, we need to reframe how we design it, implement it, and evaluate it. Let me offer three kind of thoughts for the audience today. How do we look for proportionality? How do rules reflect the size, risk, and capacity of the actor? A multinational and smallholder farmer should not face the same compliance burden. Participation. Policies are more effective and legitimate when shaped by the voices of those who are most impacted. And progressiveness. Regulation should actively work to reduce inequalities, not unintentionally perpetuate them. But right now, we really do face a risk of regression, a watering down, if you like, or politicization of core human rights and environmental expectations. In today's shifting landscape, human rights due diligence isn't optional, it's essential. Companies adopting it now are really better positioned for that long-term success. And I'd really hope that we wouldn't lose momentum that we have gained over the recent years. And so to conclude, let me return to, I suppose, the opening of this talk. We won't just build a just and sustainable economy through deregulation alone, nor through regulation that ignores both context and voice. We need smart, inclusive, equity-driven regulations, one that enables responsible businesses, protects the vulnerable, and unlocks a shared prosperity for all. In order to get there, we must really strike that right balance between ambition and feasibility. So policymakers should draw on the practical, real practical experiences that business can offer, implementing risk-based approaches. Let's focus on those global standards. These continue to offer the strongest foundation for responsible and future-proof business practices. And how do we promote policies that go beyond the do no harm to actively promote inclusion? These are essential for long-term resilience, reducing structural inequalities. Let's not regulate, not just for growth, not just for innovation, but I would argue also for justice. Thank you so much for your attention today. I'd be delighted to stay and answer any questions that you may have. And of course, if you've got any questions about any of the work that we do at the WBCSD or the business, BCTI, the Business Commission to Tackle Inequality, I'd be delighted to reach out to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the things you said in the panel session. So what I'd like to suggest, there's a poll that's up on the screen at the moment. So if our participants wouldn't mind just filling that in, that would be very helpful. What I'd like to suggest now is that we take a kind of a 10-minute break, I think, just to allow people to stretch, get some refreshments. I realize it's getting pretty late in some parts of the world. I know we have some people from Australia and it's now sort of 10:25 p.m. But if we just take a 10-minute break and try to be back at let's say 2:36 p.m. CET, and then we'll sort of form the panel and restart, if that's okay. Thank you. Hi, Alison, welcome back. So I think we're just getting, yep, we're getting people back in. Getting from David and, oh, we've got another poll. Let me just see if I can capture that.
Somebody needs to disable my or enable my video from there because it was disabled.
Ah, right. Carolyn or Evelyn, are you able to help?
Okay, there we go.
There we go. Welcome back, Cass. Thank you. Right. So we're all back. And Carolyn, thank you very much for putting on the screen the last poll responses. Actually, I think if it's possible, I don't know if technology allows, if we could have all three polls side by side on the screen, if possible, that would help, because I think we'll be able to sort of use some of those, outcomes in terms of the responses to inform us as we go. But let's kick off, and if you can't, don't worry. So first of all, I would like to thank you all for your excellent presentations and discussions, and you brought all very different perspectives, which I think are absolutely helpful. Now, what the purpose of this session, this sort of the whole colloquium this time around, was not to suggest or imply that regulation is good and deregulation is bad. As the topic is, it's about sensible regulation and sensible deregulation. So maybe what I'd like to do is start with a question regarding can you share any examples where deregulation has led to positive outcomes, and what can we learn from these? So I'd like to start on a positive as opposed to a negative aspect to deregulation. Who would like to sort of kick off with that? Cass, thank you.
Yeah, so let me just use an example in South Africa in the last 2 years that led to a significant increase by the private sector in generating renewable energy. And the inhibiting factor there was a regulation that limited embedded energy to 10 megawatts. And there were a lot of interaction between the private sector and government, particularly given the government's inability through the power generating company to actually keep the lights on and keep the energy going. And in the president's emergency energy plan that he introduced, he did away with that ceiling of 10 megawatts. And that has now resulted in the last 2 years of close on to about 14 to 15 billion rand of investment in private sector energy generation and all renewable energy. So I think that's a reasonably good example of deregulation that leads to private sector activity and investment to the benefit of citizens generally. Thanks.
Thank you. David, would you sort of like to share, given you do a lot of advisory work across the world, are you able to sort of share with us examples where you've seen that deregulation has led to, positive outcomes in additional investments, outcomes particularly in terms of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I would say is, deregulation is an interesting one, because I think that in this area, a lot of that is coming about right now. And so we're sort of testing it out on the reporting side, obviously in Europe, but also permitting is a huge thing. Before the Trump administration, the US actually had enough applications in their grid interconnection from projects that, had all those applications been approved and those things built, the US would actually be on its 2030 track to to decarbonization. And yet everyone knew that there was no chance that about 80% of those things would get built. And so we've been talking for quite a while about, you know, the role of deregulation in really fostering faster progress. I think when it comes to red tape and when it comes to approvals, that's, I think, where you have seen simplification to make life easier. And we've seen those in terms of incentives in places, you know, across the EU, but also in other countries. The easier, you know, things like feed-in tariffs are, the easier it is for people to sell to the grid, the more we see those things happen. So I think those are working examples of how energy markets adapt. What I would say is there's a difference between that and kind of reporting simplification, with the idea that the reasons businesses, you know, in Europe aren't growing as fast as, say, those in America is because Europe has more red tape. You know, is there a truth in that? Well, objectively, there is more regulation, but when it comes down to it, is cutting things that are not necessarily regulatory approval, but rather reporting requirements, are those things that really will drive growth? I think at the margin for small companies, people do see small benefits, but for the big companies that are probably the ones that pay the most for consulting, the ones that are working the most on these kind of reports, for them, it's you know, not as much of, oh, well, our quarterly numbers are lower because we had to pay McKinsey a few million for that report. You know, that doesn't really happen. And so I think there is the truth, which is efficiency of process makes things move faster, can bring in capital. If you know, again, in addition, though, rule of law is super important. Stable economies are super important. And so I think on the one hand, definite benefit in the sense of process deregulation, less so, I think, clear when it comes to, you know, reporting and disclosure, whether that is actually the thing holding people back.
Right, thanks. Agnes, views from you, and then we'll come to Alison.
We wouldn't have too many examples in where I am of sustainability related deregulation. But we know that deregulation in the telecom industry and in the US, in the airlines industry, always brings more competitiveness and lower the cost. I can see in California, where I was there about nearly 20 years ago, and also in Australia, where my father lives, there's democratization. Did I say this word right? Sorry, democratize energy. So all these people can put solar panels on the rooftops. And recently, in the last 10 years, Hong Kong allow us to put solar power on our rooftops if you have a house. But then the lands department and buildings department have all sorts of other requirements and regulations. So it's not easy. I live somewhere where I don't own the roof. I have the ground and the first floor, and I cannot put it in my front or backyard because of the land's regulations. So it has to be all coordinated and not a silo action by any of the government agencies. When we want to democratize energy. So deregulation and democratization go hand in hand, I would believe. So I would refer back to David and Cass, and even you, Alan, for examples in your world.
Right. Alison.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you an example, but before I do so, I think it's a classic way of systems thinking. You know, we have to think about deregulations as a part of a system. And so if you deregulate, what's the emergent properties, and are those kind of advantageous or not for kind of certainly where I'm for a nature positive kind of outcome, or certainly to protect equity or social conditions. And often we think about them as in quite a binary way. So I just thought I'd just offer that just to, you know, there's always going to be a systems response to deregulations. And we work as with many organizations as part of the just transition. And how can we accelerate that just transition to decarbonizations and a nature positive kind of future? And one example I'd love to give you is when there was waived licensing fees for off-grid solar companies. This really boosted kind of rural electrification from 6% to 30% in 2 years, whilst really, really importantly, creating jobs for women-led cooperatives. So that's where I see a win-win in the just transition, where we can think about deregulation and how it can have a positive impact, not only for the decarbonization and nature, but also people as well. So how do we also make sure that we're ticking all those 3 boxes?
Yes, I mean, Agnes, you sort of asked whether I could give some examples. Certainly, I've seen a lot of deregulation taking place in Europe in the energy sector, and giving consumers choice as to what they buy and from whom they buy it, and that certainly has sort of reduced the cost of energy. Still extremely high in Europe, particularly compared to the United States of America, which is something which I can't get my mind around why it is. But that level of deregulation, which has opened up the market, brought in new players into the market, has at least enabled consumers to make choices which they didn't have before, when most of the energy was produced by state-owned corporations or organizations. So hopefully there'll be more of that taking place. And Cass, you refer to an example of that in South Africa. There was something which I saw in the poll, and I don't know, Carolyn, if you could just maybe share the poll outcomes, because I think it would be nice just to sort of reflect on that. So the first question which we asked was, how confident are you in your organizations in terms of ability to adapt to the rapidly evolving regulatory landscape? And I think it kind of links to what David said. I was pleasantly surprised to see how sort of somewhat confident to very confident the participants are in terms of how their organizations are adapting to this rapidly evolving, very volatile world of regulation stroke deregulation. I found that, as I said, surprising in a positive sense, that people who've joined us today feel that their organizations are able to adapt to that. Any observations coming from the panel on the response to this question? David, you're engaging with a lot of organizations and institutions.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think, you do see that people are, not necessarily like, what I kind of get to is it's the fact that there's a lot more skill building that's needed, a lot more knowledge that is necessary, but also recognition that resources and priorities need to be allocated for that. It would be interesting also to get a sense as people think about this stuff, not just to know kind of who feels that they're at a good place or that they want to be at that place, but rather to think about the other part of that story, which is, do you feel like you're being given the right tools to rectify that? I would be willing to assume those that do feel very confident probably are the ones that are at firms that have the greatest degree of focus on prioritizing these things. I mean, obviously you could imagine, an ignorance is bliss scenario, but I think it's far more likely that those that feel that this is priority feel so because they are, they are being supported through that process. So I think it's not just kind of where you're at, but also, do you feel like you have the tools to get there? And I think what you're seeing is people are a lot more optimistic about the overall kind of, movement toward, toward regulation that, we maybe don't feel ready, but we feel like these things are necessary. I kind of see that in that third question. Coordination is what's called for most. It's not, again, it's getting rid of that myth that regulation and business are oppositional. It's that governments that do this well put together clear regulation. Businesses hate capricious regulation. Businesses hate conflicting regulation. But when there's clarity, it's setting the rules of the game. And what we tend to find is that the markets do an incredibly good job of providing that service. It reminds me always of the story in the Second World War of Franklin Roosevelt, the US president, telling companies that he wanted to produce 100,000 or 50,000 planes rather in 1944. And everyone said, from Ford to others, that was impossible. And that year they turned out 100,000 because industry has the ability to run, but it needs to be directed. And it was the same with compliance with the Clean Air Act. It was the same with compliance with sulfur dioxide, acid rain. This is going to be hard. We're not going to do it. It was the same with the ozone hole, which is, if there's clarity and direction, I think that's what is looked for, and that's what actually ultimately benefits business in turning these things forward.
Yes.
I'm happy to kind of jump in here as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just to concur with that, because often businesses spend a huge amount of time actually asking for regulation. Certainly those front runners in business, where they can see the advantages of good regulations to set both a level playing field, but also to benefit, not only good business, but to protect, the planet and nature and people as well. So, the effort and the advocacy that goes to kind of asking for good regulation should not be unnoticed. I'd also like to just respond to, are businesses prepared for the changing and evolving landscape? Well, they might be, and increasingly so, but it's the proportionality of time spent on navigating that regulatory landscape. Resources are scarce internally in business, and there is many organizations are repeatedly saying where time is spent is on reporting on compliance versus action and progression. And so we have to always think if we're ready for regulation, great, but at what cost? Is that a cost of kind of, action internally as well? So we just got to make sure that we have that proportionality right.
No, that's a good point. Cass, Agnes, anything to add, or we can just move on?
I would concur with that. I think I said it in my input that it's not a question of not wanting regulation or the laissez-faire kind of approach. It's appropriate regulation that's enables businesses to actually play the role they can play. So I think I concur with those comments. Thanks.
And if the regulations comes from the government or the leadership, the government that leads with the foresight and with the vision, like Singapore, like now what China is saying, and if they stay on course with that, that will give everybody the same level playing field, and there will be a lot more comparability of disclosures and of data. So that will actually help stakeholders like investors and financiers to make our decisions. So it depends on whether the regulations are really effective, really useful. Everybody has to comply. But we're always saying to companies that compliance is the lowest bar. And there are companies that tell us we operate in several regions, several jurisdictions. What kind of compliance do we do? And we always suggest to them that whatever is the highest bar amongst those jurisdictions, but that is even your lowest bar. You need to get higher than that and be able to do the right thing and the ethical thing all the time.
Thanks. That kind of brings me to one of the questions I thought it would be worth us exploring, which is, I think you're touching on this, and certainly you've implied this, but in your view, what role does collaboration between governments, the private sector, so business, and civil society play in creating effective and sort of sustainable regulatory policies?
So are you directing this question
Yeah,
to me?
well, to
I
all of
think.
you, but
All right.
we've got
I
you, so
start.
let's start with you.
Yeah. I start first. So Hong Kong takes a very consultative approach. Whenever we set any rules, regulations like disclosure rules, it's in the listing rules. So Hong Kong is very interesting in the sense that the stock exchange sets the listing rules. Those are not law, but the stock exchange has the power to pause the listing of the company or even delist the company if they don't abide by those listing rules. So in those listing rules, there are disclosure rules, and now it's revised climate related, which is ISSB aligned disclosures. And so we always take a very consultative approach here in Hong Kong. And even in China, before the 3 stock exchanges really finalized on their disclosure requirements, they had a period of consultation. Of course, that period is a lot shorter than would be in Hong Kong. We have 3 months, 4 months, and in China, that would be like 1.5 months. But if we have this open discussion and we welcome, the stock exchange had actually received hundreds of responses, and they took all those into account before they aligned the new climate disclosures to the ISSB. So there are some areas where we go a little bit slower. For example, internal carbon pricing. For example, we definitely have not asked any company to think about assurance yet. It's not required by ISSB, but of course CSRD has that. And so we collaborate, and even the Hong Kong, we have a cross-agency steering committee that gets together the stock exchange, the Securities Futures Commission, the Insurance Authority, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which is our pseudo central bank. Our real central bank is, of course, the People's Bank of China, and the Environmental Bureau, and so on. And so we get a collective, consultative approach, getting the government and the private sector to input into what the government should be publicizing or publishing to direct the city forward, so that we can meet our Climate Action 2050 plans.
Right. Yes, how does that work in your part of the world? I mean, specifically South Africa, but also if you have any views across the rest of the African continent.
Yeah, so I mean, there are normal parliamentary and regulatory processes of consultation and enabling businesses and other stakeholders to actually comment on regulation, go to parliament and so on, which work reasonably well depending on the government department involved and so on. But I think that what's to me interesting in South Africa is that in the last 3 years or so, we've had business and government has had a very specific and structured partnership led on the government side by the president and led on business side. When I was at Busa, I was one of those, and then the CEO of Discovery, Adrian Go, and the South African head of Rothschild, Martin Kingston, the 3 of us led on the business side.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a structured partnership with CEOs involved, with the president involved. And that has looked at the regulatory environment from the point of view of what environment do we need to actually address our energy issues, our logistics issues, and our crime and corruption issues. And I think that's sort of a partnership with regular meetings with the president and his people every 6 to 8 weeks, with a structure between government and business at a high level to unblock blockages between those meetings, and with the active involvement of chief executives from particular businesses, it's actually led to a very collaborative approach towards regulation and has speeded up the promulgation of appropriate regulation, deregulation where it's necessary, like in the energy case, and then appropriate regulation and self-regulation where that's also possible. So I think that's sort of a partnership, not a normal public-private partnership, but a very specific structure. On the rest of the continent, I think that the relationship, in my view, between sort of organized business and government is probably more mature in South Africa than it is in many other parts of the continent. So in many other parts of the continent, I think it's more an approach of government putting legislation on the table, people commenting on it. Yeah.
Right. But we've got, good examples. So, sorry, Alison, I was going to come. Yeah, I was just going to comment and then come to you. But let me come.
Sorry, apologies. Do you want to
No. This is about building on what people are saying and your own views and things. So please.
Yeah, no, just building on that. So I think the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, plays a really critical convening role here. Being invited into kind of regulatory development is absolutely essential to have the voice of business. Yet for decades, there's been a closed door. So I've had the good fortune of working across many sectors, including business, but also NGO and academia. And it's incredible how the invitations flow if you're in a particular sector and not another. So we have to have all those sectors at the table. Without such, we simply do not have the perspectives of the system. So how can you develop good regulation without having those kind of perspectives, those real world examples, the practical applications, the unintended consequences, the reality of implementation? And so business shouldn't be seen as necessarily a blocker for good regulation, but how can we make sure that this is effective and ensure kind of good compliance moving forward? But also, how do we make sure that we represent the voice of society? So how does civil society also have that rightful place in those, development and discussions and, adjusting and nudging of good regulations as well? Without those voices, again, coming back to what I talked to earlier, those with least power, has disproportionate disadvantage here.
David.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, having worked with, the Climate Financial Risk Forum in the UK, which is a great cooperative effort between the regulators and the financial system, having worked at UNEP-FI, trying to bring together supervisors and regulators. What I would say is, for the most part, it really is indeed the case that nobody has the full perspective. And I think we often forget that when we're frustrated with regulation. We kind of say, oh, well, they don't get it. And it's like, yes, but that's the point, that many people in a regulatory role maybe haven't been in industry. Sometimes they have, but the point is to make sure full perspectives are incorporated and assimilated really does demand a active and ongoing conversation. And to recognize that interests may not always align. The object of regulators is going to be, very often tied to a public good. The object of institutions and organizations may be tied, to their own either financial or other objectives. But it's recognizing kind of what interests people represent, but also, I think, cause and effect. What are the effects of this? Again, this to me is one of the lessons that gets relearned time and again, but gets relearned in the context of the EU and the omnibus, which is, had this been more from what will the implementation itself be like, we could have put what is in the omnibus into practice back in 2020, 2021, and where we'd be today probably is actually further ahead of where we are now. But I think that that's why having that consideration of what the implementation is and what the effects are really does matter so much.
Thanks. Can I just tease you on one thing that you said, just to see sort of where you and fellow panelists think, because you mentioned, public good from the perspective of governments and regulators. And I think you mentioned and businesses about, their own, profit objectives or whatever. But I would imagine that you also would see that almost every corporation, whether it's for profit or not for profit, ultimately is there to serve a public good as an outcome. Would you agree with that?
I think it's about, sorry, I'm
jumping
in. You go first.
No.
I think ultimately everyone has the same goals, but it's to what
I
degree.
think so, but I'd like to
degree? To what
tease that out
degree?
in the conversation across the panel.
And also, governments have responsibility to business, and the economic stability of the country or the region that they're kind of identifying. I've certainly had some of the most progressive discussions, with certain parts of the government when really looking to kind of, how do we accelerate economic growth, and sometimes that trumps the public good. So I would say both government and business have these goals in place, but it's to what degree. And I think that's context specific. I think it's specific to a particular sector. I think it's specific to a particular region, or indeed a company themselves.
David?
Yeah, I would say that, for the most part, governments are designed to act in the public interest, but we in certainly in representative democracies, but even in ones that aren't, there's a social contract there, which very clearly, says that we will sort of, tolerate this, to the extent that we are able to, continue improving our lives, we are able to continue, living in peace and security, whatever it is. So there's always some contract. What I think is sometimes government activities have to take roles that are not necessarily in the imminent interests, but might be in the longer term interest. And that kind of long-term planning is one thing that governments can sometimes do more effectively than corporations. I don't think corporations are unable to do it. And I think there's a myth that, corporations can't. If you're talking to any fossil fuel company, they're kings of long-term planning when it comes to drilling a well, when it comes to doing a geological survey. That is nothing if not long-term planning. And yet, when it comes to financial incentives, that's the place where when we talk about short-termism, when we talk about things maybe that aren't serving a social purpose, we are talking about, the aim of returning capital in the near term, and that might have other consequences if that objective conflicts. So I think, across those two groups, governments and companies, they may, in ideal working, both contribute to the public good, the government explicitly, the company implicitly. But I think where we get kind of jumbled is in these time horizons and in these kind of competing incentives.
Thanks. Yeah, I certainly agree with you. There's this implicit requirement for companies to take care of not only their primary sort of stakeholders, which they may consider to be, investors or shareholders, but they have a bigger purpose, which is to satisfy the needs of, all stakeholders, including society at large. And I think that's becoming a lot clearer today. I see you're nodding, Cass. Would you like to?
No, if I could come in, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, if you look at, again, just with the South African example, given the sort of lack of capacity and inability of the government to fulfill some of its responsibility, if you look at the way many mining houses conduct their business nowadays, they conduct their business in a way that they provide power, they provide water, they provide accommodation to communities in which they work. And certainly the sort of approach some of us have taken in organized business, in our discussions with our members, is that these aren't costs. These are actually investments in strengthening and expanding your markets. Because if people are prosperous, if people live well, if people spend money. And so I think to talk about these sorts of initiatives and this way of doing business as some sort of CSI type of stuff, not that CSI isn't important, as against actually talking to businesses about this, that it's an investment in stabilizing and expanding our markets. I think it's two different conversation.
Right. I had one question, which I think comes from what David had said, and Alison too, is, this issue of how do we build capacity within regulatory bodies to ensure that they have the necessary skills and resources to implement, develop good regulation that's effective and can be implemented, but also as they go through the deregulation and simplification journey that they are needing to take. How do we make sure that we can get necessary skills? Maybe I come to you, Alison, because obviously, the WBCSD work, as you said, collaboratively with national governments and regulators, etc. Any tips on how we could address any skill gaps that might exist within the regulatory framework?
Yeah, I think, I think the first thing to acknowledge is, the aim here is not to, at the end, be a business leader. The aim is to understand the language of different sectors and how can we truly have listening skills that allow us to understand where the common ground is. So I think we had some examples just here. We talk about this in a particular way in business. We talk about it this way in government. We talk about it this way in potentially civil society. How do we have some of those systems thinking skills in order to pull those perspectives together and understand that there's more in common than we potentially realize? Our human brains, I'm actually, forgive me for a second here, this is part of my academic research, but the human brains we're predicted to hear what we've already experienced. So what we see, hear, and experience in a meeting, and in a meeting like this, and a meeting with kind of, business and government, we're always predicted to see, hear based on our past experiences. Yet we can actually expand that kind of perspective with time together, understanding with the right skills and the right kind of either technology or particular kind of skills in order to kind of receive those perspectives. And so I would say, we can't just expect to rock up and understand what those differences are. We've got to make real concerted effort to engage with business, civil society, to really glean those perspectives. So the end result is not to become a business leader. The end result is not to become a leader in civil society. The end result is to listen and to understand the common good.
So, yeah. David, I mean, you do a lot of consulting work. Any sort of tips as to how regulatory bodies can sort of raise the skill capabilities to ensure that they put in place really good quality, effective regulation that can be implemented and have an impact in society?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we work quite a lot also with governments as well as directly with financial institutions and corporates. Very often they're looking at how do you build capacity across the sector. And I think what that means is it kind of breaks down to 4 different areas of where that skill building begins. One is clear communication. Just, we have this regulation. It's out there. We did some work with the central bank in Kenya a few years ago that focused on their work and really their focus of, this is the stuff that has been promulgated from us. Here's what you need to do. So making that connection is one. The second thing is ensuring that organizations are actually doing some of the legwork themselves. So it's not just, oh, well, you have to report on this, but what is actually going on? And that means kind of having those conversations both on awareness, why does this matter, but also what are you doing about it? So before we even get into the numbers, on a qualitative basis, how does this tie into strategy? Then I think often there's, a role around the quantitative side. So that's on things like analytical tools. How do we decide what data we do and don't have, what data we should have? A lot of times people say we don't have the data, and you ask, but did you look? And the answer often is no to that. And I think as a result of that, we need to think more about what we have and how we put it to good use. And then the final one, I think, is actual kind of on-the-job training. People, you can't just give training to a program. You can't just give information. You're giving it always to a person. I always used to say when we worked at UNEP-FI, we don't work with the institutions, we work with the individuals. They work with their institutions. They are the point of the spear. And so giving people the knowledge, okay, this is what you need to do on this report. This is what you need to do when you're conducting scenario analysis. This is what you need to do when you're engaging with clients and updating your credit policies. But you need to hear it, not, you know, such and such bank or such, because at an entity level, that is just, you know, you might as well speak to the front doors. You know, it's just going to bounce off. It's the relationship managers who are going to speak to the clients. It's the, you know, people on the risk team that are going to integrate this into their models. It's knowing where that goes, and that specific piece to me is what makes those other three bits come together.
Thanks. Just because I'm conscious of time and we need to sort of go into the question session. Just a quick fire. So have you seen any examples in your jurisdictions or, you know, across regions or globally where regulators have conducted post-implementation reviews to, you know, assess the effectiveness? Because, you know, there's always a tendency, as I said in my opening remarks, that regulators feel they need more regulation. And sometimes it's not a bad thing. And maybe that's what's happening now in the US and in Europe and other parts of the world, where not necessarily taking a step back, but actually saying, let's take a look at what we've put in place to see whether it's really as effective as it needs to be, whether it can be implemented as intended, whether it's going to have the desired impacts that that the regulations were set out to achieve. Are you seeing examples where regulators consistently conduct post-implementation reviews to guide them in terms of where they need to go next?
Let me try to start, and I certainly see that. I was mentioning the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and with the listing rules and with the change, we have various different phases of ESG reporting requirements. So I will start with this one example and then move on to another one. So from 2014, there's been voluntary and then become partly mandatory, and now with the ISSB aligned, every year the stock exchange samples 400 different sustainability reports now. So we have 2,600 listed issuers. So 400 something. Every year they sample that randomly, not just the large ones, randomly. But how they don't have enough manpower to read it, so they deploy AI to help a little bit. But at the end of the day, there's still the VPs and the managers are reading the part of the results of the reports. So they try to see whether the companies are having difficulties in complying with the rules of disclosures, where they fall short, and then from that they calibrate, and then they put together training programs and put it free on ESG Academy on the stock exchange. So every company's board directors can go and access and get themselves educated. And so there are free workshops and so on that they co-curate with service providers. So they do monitor that, at least in Hong Kong. And the Securities and Futures Commission is very particular about monitoring the fund managers, asset managers' disclosures, whether they do it according to TCFD as required. And so they do that. And therefore, they can make sure that they are on track. And if they are not, then there would be consequences, which is already very explicit from day one. But then they also give them a lot of capacity building help, a lot of guidance as well, support. That's in the financial markets, but in the green building area, the building at Hong Kong, 60% of our emissions come from buildings. It's because of the operation, air conditioning and so on. And part of that, the embedded carbon has not been totally explicitly measured and monitored. But then now the government has been progressively requiring buildings, the new ones, to meet certain standards. And progressively they are monitoring, and they require the building owners to the managers to report, to share the data with them. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority has collected data through all the banks of all their clients of sustainability using a simplified CDP questionnaire. And so with that, they have a centralized data repository, and they monitor that. They monitor the progress of how these, especially smaller companies, can adapt to climate risk and take care of climate risk, and can disclose more and more sustainability related data. So there's been a progressive for the last at least 10, 15 years of doing so by our government. Yes, I see that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Alison, anything to add in terms of sort of regulators looking at, not just marking their own homework, but actually checking to see whether what they're doing is
perhaps it's a personal example that springs to mind. I spent many years in health and food and working with regulators across the globe, actually, and I've got one particular regulator in mind when I share this example, where there was some legislation that was put into place on particular targets for food to kind of change their formulations, and it wasn't practical. We literally could not produce foods that were safe for consumption in order to do that. And despite submitting many, many documents articulating this in many meetings, that was ignored or considered as blocking the regulations. And so instead, I invited the head of the Food Standards Agency at the time to come on some factory tours with me. And they graciously accepted, and I didn't have to say anything. So we had these wonderful factory managers who simply talked to safety and food safety and how it was technically not feasible to go below a certain threshold. That was fundamental. That changed the regulatory kind of position of the government pretty quickly. And so I just come to that, is how do we understand each other's worlds? Sometimes it's not blocking, we were encouraging, these targets, but how do we do it in a way that we can actually have, viable kind of products as well?
Yeah, so it was back to the collaboration point earlier between regulators, governments, and business. Cass, anything to add? Because we're going to
no, very quickly. I mean, we do have a not a regulation, but a process in place to look at regulatory impact assessments. But they're not done very often, and they're not done very diligently. So there have been pieces of legislation where we've dragged government into doing regulatory impact assessments. There's some instances where we've done assessments ourselves and made it available to government on that basis, get them to relook at the legislation. But there is a policy in place, but it's not applied to diligently.
Yeah, because certainly if you're an international standard setter, then that is just part of your standard setting process, that you do post-implementation reviews, and you look at how the implementation adoption of your standard is going, and if you find that they're not actually being widely adopted or implemented, then that tells you that they're probably not necessarily fully fit for the different jurisdictions you would like them to be implemented in. Last word from you, David.
Yeah, I mean, I really do echo a lot of what's been said here. I mean, what could I add? I think part of it is really keeping our eye on the prize and on the aim, which is what are you hoping that removing this regulation or adding this regulation will do, and is there a clarity between that theory of change and the actual, whether our goal is to, reduce inequality, whether that goal is to grow faster, whatever it is. But I think very often that hard scrutiny that actually subjects it to a theory of change doesn't always actually make it into a lot of the structuring. And then you get the issues that we have. But the only way to know if that is going to make sense is to consider the different stakeholders in the same way that everyone can easily see that a law that, you know, aims to boost growth by cutting environmental protections might not be good for the community where pollution is being dumped. It becomes a question of how do we consider all the stakeholders? How do we avoid unintended consequences? And do we believe, because I do think there's a laissez-faire underlying component, which is a regulation should only exist insofar as it provides benefit, and it provides, whether that's societal benefit, whether that is clarity, whether it's safety. But, you know, we don't create these things. You know, I think whether you're, you know, a real kind of traditional liberal or more, you know, in the modern camp, nobody wants more government and more regulation than is necessary. The place we dispute and disagree is just on where that line is. But I think we should still use it as a guiding principle of trying to be parsimonious, but recognizing that in anything we add or detract or subtract, that there needs to be a clarity. And so, you know, just throwing open, you know, our rivers to pollution, allowing, you know, our lands to be logged and turned into developments may very well have those unintended consequences if it hasn't been done in proper consultation and proper discussion. And I think that's why, you know, regulations shouldn't make things move slower, but regulations themselves should be developed at a thoughtful pace.
Thank you. So thank you all very much. You know, thank you, Agnes, thank you, Cass, thank you, Alison, and thank you, David, for this panel session. So what we're now going to do is we're just going to pivot to Carolyn, who's going to, you know, look at the questions that have been coming in from our participants across the world, and, you know, put them to the panel. They may be observations rather than specific questions, but if I could hand over to you, Carolyn, if that's okay.
Perfect, perfect. I'm just going to start from the top. I don't see any upvoting in terms of the questions, so I'll start from the top. And Albert's questions actually got some, Amanda's also commented on that. So Albert's saying there's an increasing trend of companies delisting from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And it's not only the JSE, in fact, it's a trend worldwide. How much of this trend is because of overregulation? Basically, it's regulation is too onerous, and then Amanda responded, partly regulation, which the JSE is trying to resolve with, is a simplification project, but also the fact that there are many alternatives for capital raising, both debt and equity. But I see that also the implications for the new draft of the King report is also try to drive a simplification, so to speak. So how does the panel feel, Alan, about this increasing trend for organizations to delist, and do you think it is because of the overregulation of stock exchanges?
Well, I'll give my own view. There might be an element of overregulation, but I don't think that's the primary driver for relisting on other stock exchanges. I think it's the depth of the market, the availability of equity and debt capital. It's also the cost of capital that often drives companies. When I look at, you know, I live on the continent of Europe, and some examples of what I've seen is, you know, companies in the UK that were listed, you know, on the LSE are moving to the US, but that's not necessarily driven by lesser regulation to the US compared to the UK, because in some cases, state by state, and David will know this better than me, there's some states which actually have more regulation than some of the European countries. He's given examples of New York and California. So I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, I can't speak for the JSE. I have no experience there, but I'll ask, you know, you'll have a view and Cass will have a view certainly on that. But it's where the depth of the capital market is, and it's also where the best coverage you're going to get in terms of the analyst understanding of your industry. And that's what I see a lot of companies where, you know, from the UK, they're now sort of 40 to 60% of their business is now in the US. So they feel that it's better to have a listing there because they have a better coverage from the analyst point of view. The investor community will understand their industry better, and therefore they will have a deeper access to capital. That's what I see happening, particularly those that are relisting into the US market. It's not driven by excessive regulation per se. There may be an element of that.
Thank you, Alan. And David?
Carolyn,
Yeah, Agnes.
Sorry, David, would you like to go first?
Oh, no, please go ahead, and then I'll go after you. No worries.
Thank you. I totally agree with Alan. It's the depth of the capital markets, and also because institutional investors, the large ones like BlackRock, they manage 10 trillion and more US dollars. So these large institutional investors can really favor companies that have a market cap of 1 billion US dollar or more. And if you look at the listings in Africa, there are maybe 30 to maybe maximum 60 companies that reach that market cap to attract institutional investors. And so by moving the listing to London or to US, it may have more liquidity and get more investors in to recognize them, even if they're not at the 1 billion mark. So I believe that that is the other element to it. And if you list in NASDAQ, the governance requirement is of your jurisdiction of your domicile of the company. So if the company is domiciled in BVI in Cayman Islands, you know how those governance standards are. But NASDAQ accepts that, right? So even in a financial market like Hong Kong, we have 2,600 listed issuers. We only have something like 500 companies that would meet the $1 billion market cap threshold. So a lot of the other companies do not attract enough institutional investors' money. And if they don't, then it is not having the nudge from the investors to disclose better, to have more transparency, to really keep track on their commitments in sustainability and so on. And so there are so many elements that are at play.
Thank you, Agnes. David?
Yeah, I was going to say, I really do believe that for the most part, this is, again, it's about the depth of capital markets. It's also about what valuation you can get. You're seeing this kind of the push-pull between London and other places. And efficiency to me is the necessary but is not sufficient criteria, which is make it really desirable to list. That's a really good way to attract. But if you're not going to be able to get people the valuations that are desired because of the size, that is going to be a more decisive factor. So I would say for most, it's really going to be partially about the experience, partially about the valuation, and less so about how onerous it is. I think what we begin to see is there are smaller jurisdictions that maybe do want to move really fast, maybe do want to, pull something in. But I think that kind of stuff is not that effective necessarily when it comes to actually really building something durable. It's kind of a question of if you're going to allow, high degree of opacity, if you're going to allow minimal reporting, what kind of capital are you attracting? Is that the capital you want to be attracting? I think kind of begs the question. And so to me, that's the balance. Is it shouldn't be onerous. It needs to be efficient, but that's just a minimum criteria when we're talking about, bigger markets, Singapore, Hong Kong, New York, London, like that. Those are the push pulls that I see between these places.
And as you said, it's not about the rules, and they will always be moaning about the rules, but give the market direction, and they will achieve it. But we are going to have moaning and groaning as part of the process. But Cass, can you speak specifically in terms of the South African context and the JSE?
I would concur. I don't think cost is the factor. I think it is the depth of the capital markets. I think it is the efficiency of the stock exchange, the capacity of the stock exchange. and other factors. I certainly not in the South African market have found any major corporates talking about costs when they delist and list elsewhere. It also depends on what decisions global offices are taking, where they want to be domiciled, what makes sense, and so on. So it's more those factors than costs, certainly in my experience. Thanks.
Thanks. And David, while we're in this area, just ask a question. Question from Damien. David mentioned that we have to listen to business. To what extent is the omnibus action in Europe due to businesses not engaging enough with the regulators? And the CSRD was adopted after a period of consultation. Are business forums not engaging enough with the regulators during the period and then throwing their toys out of the cot once their directors have adopted? So what are you seeing?
I would say that some of what we're seeing in the omnibus is a pushback from business, definitely. I would also say that some of these red flags had been raised during the process of consultation. So I don't think it is necessarily being caught unawares. I think how true that is in direct proportion to how big the firm is. So really big firms, that is going to be very true. But yeah, for SMEs, yeah, there probably are a number that were kind of surprised, caught off guard. I don't believe, like, even if, you know, the pushback, especially against CSDDD, has been done in their names, I don't believe their voices are the decisive ones. I do think there wasn't enough kind of flow and exchange between those that actually have to act on these things and those that are putting them into practice. And so I don't think it was a disengaged business community as much. If I would fault the business community at that stage, the place I would fault it is, I think there was probably, if anything, too much over enthusiasm of, oh, we can do this, you know, very similar to the net zero commitments of, we're not sure how. And now that, you know, the bill has come, it's like, hey, we'd like 3 dozen oysters. And then you're like, oh, shoot, those were expensive. You know, it's like, you're kind of, now you have the bill with you. But maybe, you know, so I don't think it was disengagement. If anything, it was over optimism. And I think on the regulatory side, the blame kind of lies with, you know, not really working this through to what is the actual outcome going to be? How onerous is that going to be for organizations to do? And I think those are the places where, you know, lessons can and should be learned.
Absolutely. It's the implementation and understanding the implementation that was underestimated, and certainly is still being underestimated. We're adopting roadmaps in terms of adopting, you know, countries are adopting IFRS S1 and S2, and then the actual organizations are not able to fulfill it because they don't know the implementation. And that's where Agnes was speaking about. We need some guidance, we need some help in terms of implementation. So there's a question I'm going to, yes, Agnes?
We also need data, right? The data is just rolling out in the recent 5 to 3 years. When I wrote my dissertation, I couldn't find the data. And now MSCI said that they're going to be offering academics 3 sets of data. And I was just so amazed. I had to beg everybody for data like 5 years ago.
It's so easy these days.
Now we have data, but then the cost of inaction is also escalating astronomically. The estimate of those numbers keep changing, and with the shifting regulatory landscape, this is all about change management, which leadership and management and investors, corporates, governments are not attuned to. Nobody is trained in change management. Nobody is trained in the communication and getting everybody together to let's do it so that we can change for the better. So this is why I say it's part of the reason.
Absolutely. Thanks, Agnes. I'm going to take a last question because then we would like to ask Prof. King to wrap up. And the last question, I'm going to swing back then into social equity, Alison, to your side. And the question from Sonia is, on the criteria of social equity, what has been the response or impact on US companies operating outside of the US specifically, also inside, to the removal of the DEI policies at their USA headquarters? Okay, so they're outside, and this is what's happened and headquartered in the US. Have you had a sense of that from your business community?
Yes, well, I could speak for 3 hours on this or more if you allow me to. So I'll try and be quite succinct here. So we run a very robust working group on DE&I, and this community really needed to come together to understand and navigate through. Sorry, my
No, we can't hear any background. It's fine.
Good. I can. And so what does this mean? You know, lots of organizations were receiving letters if they were a federal supplier, and it's you know, incredible the amount of organizations that actually are connected and are a federal supplier. So they were receiving letters urging them to urgently stop any activities on D&I. So what does that mean? Then we saw organizations receiving letters of the same through their embassies in different parts of the world. So it wasn't just centered on the US. This was now becoming a global conversation. And so as a group, as many organizations coming together, we started to kind of segment this kind of this activity. And I would say there was a bit of a trifurcation at that moment, and still is. You know, there's those who are really standing strong and saying we are, you know, not changing anything to our D&I kind of programs for these reasons. Others who were scaling down, or I would say adjusting. I've not seen any organization put a full stop in any programs. None. Even those that might be kind of making the headlines. And those that are monitoring, going, wow, this is kind of moving so quickly. I am not sure what to do. I'm going to monitor the situation. And so what we've done is pulled together a bit of a navigation kind of tool for organization as a collective. So saying, what's the evolving landscape? What's the business risk? What does it look like legally? What's the geographical risk? What's the reputational risk? How can we look at this, you know, in terms of materiality? So it's not just the right thing to do. This is good for business as well. So how can we make sure that we've got the evidence base really crisp? Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. Be really crisp on that to build the evidence base. What's your communication strategy? What does that look like externally, internally? And something that was evolving, which was called the embassy model. So how can you continue to have these activities, but maybe not communicate overtly externally? Many organizations are doing that. And then finally, what does this mean for your programming? How do you evolve? How do you adapt? Many parts of the world have had to do this for many years. So if you look to the Gulf region, they're having to kind of continue with their D&I programs, but it looks different, you know. So how can we learn from some of those kind of geographies? And what does D&I kind of 2.0 really look like in terms of how we talk to it? What's the business impact? And how do we protect those most vulnerable in our societies and within our kind of walls of our organization? Hopefully
Thanks, Alison.
helps to answer some of the
No, that's fine.
Yes.
One of the things you said is scope 1, 2, 3 in the context of social. That's interesting because we only know scope 1, 2, 3 in the context of greenhouse gas emissions, but I'm going to leave that for now. Alan has got his hand up, but I'm going to hand over to you, Alan, to conclude the panel discussion anyway.
Yeah, but I just wanted to quickly comment on this. I think it's an absolutely great question to ask. But I just want to build on what Carolyn had said. DE&I is critical for any organization, whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, whether it's public or private. And if you just think about it, if you are not diverse, if you don't provide equality, and if you're not inclusive, you will fail ultimately, and you will not live up to what your purpose, whatever that purpose is. So it's not dead. And I think, and I sit on two company boards that have, in fact, the largest part of our businesses are in the USA. And we've had a very good discussion about this. And what we need to do is make sure we reinforce the purpose. I think that was the point that Alison was saying. Why is this important to us? Because if we think about our employee brand and the attractiveness of the companies to employ the greatest people in the world and retain them so we can be successful and competitive and fulfill our duties to society at large, we have to, therefore, by definition, be diverse. equitable, and inclusive. I think it's just the problem is the narrative of what that is has got out, has gone out of control, and therefore people believe that you're only there because of D&I. No, D&I is part and parcel of the DNA of any organization, and those that don't understand that won't be around in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time. So, we have to be, respectful of the democratic process in the US. The president was elected, therefore he has the authority, etc., to rescind regulations, etc. We have to respect that, but we also have to recognize we have a duty to society at large, and performing those duties includes, as I've said, being D, being E, and being I. So it's not by any means off the table. It's actually allowing us to have the proper conversations which convince those who think it's woke to understand actually it's not. It's very important. So that's all I just wanted to say on this. Thank you. Sorry about the length of time.
No, that's absolutely perfect. Alison, you wanted to add there quickly.
It's just, Alan, that was beautifully kind of said, and I couldn't agree more. So it's good for business and it's good for society. We just need to be really crisp and articulate that when it can get quite an emotive topic very, very quickly. So how do we just make sure that we look at this like any other lens of sustainability? And as soon as we present that, then good organizations will realize how important it is to their success and society at large. Yeah.
Thank you. Alan, would you like to conclude the panel discussion?
Well, I think I don't need to say anything other than to thank our fantastic panelists. They've brought such diverse knowledge and expertise and experiences to the conversation. So I really appreciate you taking a big chunk of your time, not just now, but of course in all the time you've used to prepare for today. And thank you so much for being with this. I hope the people who've participated, we still have close to 300 people online at the moment, but we started with about 320 at 1 p.m. CET. So I really thank you for sort of sharing your thoughts and a very good panel interactive discussion. And thank you, Caroline, for of course moderating the questions from sort of for the people online. Of course, as always, we can never answer all of the questions, but obviously you've captured what they are. And if any of the panelists feel that they would like to add anything further, then of course you can share the questions and you can then post them on the GGA website.
I'll do that.
I think with that, I need to hand over to Mervyn, who is going to make some closing remarks. So Mervyn, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to all the panelists for your presentations. Over the history of business, there's always been periods of over-regulation by government. There have been periods of deregulation, usually because of economic and political reasons. But today it's because of economic, political, environmental, and social reasons. And President Trump, just as an example, believes that we've gone too far on the question of DEI, for example, on the question of environmental regulations, like moving away from the Paris Accord. But we are on businesses on this river of a milieu. We're either in a milieu of government regulation, and the weakness there is that it's one size fits all, and usually it doesn't, or deregulation, which happens to be formulated on the basis of industry, per industry. So you will get an industry body in, let's say, motor car manufacturing being formed. They will have a code of conduct. And their purpose is to cut red tape, but they mustn't cut corners. So that the code of conduct that they develop, which members, if they join this industry-specific body, must be one that causes them to be accountable, and there must be enforcement principles in that code of conduct of that industry-specific body. And definitely, when you have self-regulation, you need enhancement of corporate reporting. You've just got to be more open and more transparent. And the rules, I won't call them regulations, laid down, principles laid down by this industry-specific body, must be outcomes-based for that industry, and must be to create value, but in a sustainable manner. Must be to have ways of doing things different from the one-size-fits-all of a government regulation to an industry-specific one, but cause the community in which the company member of that institution belongs to have trust and confidence in every company in that industry-specific body. And also, not only that, but they have to make sure that they continue with legitimacy of operation. And as I said, enforcement. If they don't comply, then they must be able to enforce their principles. So we are, in fact, floating on a river of deregulation at the moment, internationally. And I believe that corporate reporting is going to be absolutely essential in this era of deregulation. And the industry-specific body that is created must be aware of the adverse impacts which that industry has had on society and the environment. So it's not only economic and political. And call on its members to actually say how, in carrying on their business in that industry, they are negating or ameliorating those negative impacts on society and environment. Because, as Alan has said, I think we've gone too far down the road. So President Trump can very well say he avoids DEI, but you cannot avoid the social and environmental issues and what I've called integrated thinking. You cannot do it. And today, very few, certainly limited liability companies around the world think still in silos. They think on this integrated basis through the three pillars of sustainable development: the economy, society, and the environment. So deregulation, I'm afraid, because of overregulation through outcries of public events such as the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the GFC, when you have this public outcry, usually you get a call for government to regulate, and then you have this one-size-fits-all, which usually causes problems. So deregulation has the advantage. It does free entrepreneurship, it does free thinking, but the industry body that is formed on the deregulation must take account that the world no longer operates just on a basis of success is increased profit, increased share price, increased dividends. It's a world where we have value creation in a sustainable manner, and their rules and regulations have to be directed to that, and of course an enhancement in accountability, which means more transparent and detailed corporate reporting in that industry. So that would be my summation of what has happened today, Alan. And I think it's interesting how over the years we've moved from a lot of government regulation to more deregulation, to more regulation, self-regulation. And we've put the word sensible in front of both. Well, sensible regulation is more difficult by government because you have this one size all. Sensible deregulation is industry specific. So you can actually focus on that industry and make sure that your members become intellectually, honestly apply their minds to what's been adverse impacts on the environment and society, and they must ameliorate that and report it as such. So that's how I sum up what has happened today. And whether we like it or not, we are floating on a river at the moment of deregulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. King. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, to Cass, David, Alison, Agnes. Thank you so much. Thank you to my chair, Alan Johnson. It's lovely to have Alan pull this together like he does the board meetings. And thank you to the attendees. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have this event. So thank you all for joining, and we hope that you'll join us in our future webinars and in our future events as we take this conversation forward. Our next colloquium is in November. Please watch out for the notifications of that. We're going to continue this conversation, but really dig deeper into the work that TNFD is doing, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and bring alignment around that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks again, Prof. King, for closing our colloquium today. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend when we get there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
See you next time. Bye now.
And safe travels, Agnes.
Thank you so
Yes.
much. Thank you. Bye-bye.